This happened many years ago. When I was about 19, I worked as a receptionist, greeting people at a small but highly successful law firm. The firm had four partners, and the main one was a woman after whom the company was named. She was strict, like Judge Judy. So I'll call her Judy. A new lawyer joined the team. Let's call her Anna. We had attorneys handling real estate deals, personal injuries, finances, and criminal cases, but Anna specialized in family law. Her primary focus was helping victims of domestic violence. At that time, all the clients who were victims were women, and Anna excelled at her job. I saw so many victims of abuse while they waited in the reception area. Sometimes, due to stress and anxiety, they'd start sharing their life stories with me right there. I did my best to comfort them. Occasionally, they had to wait an hour or more if something urgent came up. Anna fought tirelessly for these women, securing restraining orders, handling emergency hearings, police interviews, arranging shelters, and managing child custody issues. I genuinely admired her, and I still do. For those women, she was a lifeline. Anna was incredibly sophisticated and well-educated, speaking more eloquently than a character from Downton Abbey or even the Queen herself. Yet she could be blunt and occasionally swore. Hearing her discuss an abusive husband in her regal tone, saying something like, "What a pathetic little man," made us giggle. Still, she usually kept it professional around clients. Most of my time was spent handling paperwork, typing up statements under dictation, and logging calls from women about restraining orders. Their ex-partners or abusers would often try to contact them again. The calls were constant. "Hi Sabrina, he called me today at 8:15, then again at 10 a.m., and sent an email at 9 p.m. from his mom's account." I had to document everything and pass it to the court. There were so many calls that I started recognizing each client by her voice. This becomes important later. About a month after Anna started, she was featured in a newspaper article that showcased our firm's work. The article highlighted the importance of Anna's efforts to ensure safety for victims. We congratulated her, but the praise went to her head. She became arrogant and irritable, making snarky remarks to the secretaries and other staff. She grew increasingly rude, often storming into the office and barking, "Coffee, my way." I tolerated it because she was under a lot of stress and doing important work. Since this was a while ago, most documents had to be sent by fax. Anna's office was 2 doors down from the reception area. She'd warned me in advance if she was expecting something urgent, and I'd have dropped everything to bring her the papers, legal materials, police reports, or restraining orders that could literally be a matter of life and death for a client. One day, a restraining order came through for a client who was in Anna's office at that moment. The client was crying, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her story was heartbreaking. I'd typed up some of her statements and felt deeply sorry for her. The rule was clear: if something urgent arrived, I had to bring it immediately, even during a client meeting. When the document came through, I rushed to Anna's office, handed her the papers, and left. A minute later, Anna stormed into the reception area, yelling at me because the fax had a timestamp from an hour earlier. I was baffled. I'd definitely given her the papers as soon as they came through. But she wouldn't stop shouting, accusing me of endangering the client's life with my laziness and stupidity and saying I should be fired. The commotion was so loud that Judy, the firm's founder, stepped out of her office. She listened with a stone-cold expression, then calmly said, "Please, in the future, deliver documents faster to avoid any issues." Then it happened again. An 8-page document arrived for the same client, who was once more in Anna's office. I rushed over, handed her the papers, and was about to leave when Anna started yelling at me again. "This is from an hour ago, too. What the hell, Sabrina? What did I tell you?" This time, she resorted to profanity. I couldn't even get a word in. All this unfolded in front of the poor client, who looked visibly uncomfortable. Judy approached the door, her face as impassive as ever, and asked me to follow her. She asked what was going on. I explained, but Anna stormed out after us, continuing to berate me, saying I had no respect or compassion for these women, that I was lazy, utterly incompetent, and clearly had something wrong with me. I ended up crying in the bathroom. A few days later, the same client returned. Her situation had worsened, and her case made it into the newspapers. It was a horrific case. This time, all four partners and Anna were in the office with her. I went in to hand a folder to one of the partners when Anna, with a smirk, said, "This came an hour ago too, didn't it?" There's a pattern here, right in front of the client and all four of her bosses. But this time, I didn't care. The night before, I'd had one of those moments when you're lying in bed, trying to sleep, and a realization hits you like a lightning bolt. I calmly said, the documents had a timestamp an hour off, because the clocks changed for daylight saving time. You could have noticed this since the ink on the paper wasn't even dry when I handed it to you. Sure enough, the document on her desk from the day before had slightly smudged text. Our old fax machine didn't automatically update its time. My small moment of triumph was slightly ruined when, as I left the office, I tripped over my own foot and hit my head on the doorframe, giving Anna a good laugh. The next day, we had a meeting about professional behavior in the office. The client, who had witnessed Anna's outburst, approached Judy. She was deeply upset by how Anna treated the staff, and was frightened by her swearing. Judy made it clear that such behavior was unacceptable. This woman had already endured more than enough yelling and profanity in her life. Anna reluctantly apologized to me. I just shrugged. Later, Judy personally apologized for not stepping in sooner. I told her it was fine. That's when my malicious compliance kicked in. Every call I was supposed to log, instead of entering it into the shared computer spreadsheet, I wrote on a separate sticky note. As a result, I was running back and forth 10 times an hour. Anna's desk was soon buried under sticky notes with messages like, 10-hour AM, call from client X's husband. She was furious, but that was exactly what I wanted. I went through a ton of sticky notes. Then something strange happened. A woman who was in a shelter with her daughter called, saying she'd reconciled with her husband, wanted to close her case entirely, and didn't want any further contact. This happens sometimes. Victims of abuse return to their abusers when things get too hard. But this was an especially brutal case, and she'd been through a lot. I immediately informed Anna, who said she'd call the woman back in a couple of days since calling while the husband was nearby could put her in danger. I said no, call the police. She asked why. I replied, that wasn't her. I know her voice, and it wasn't her. We contacted a welfare check service, and sure enough, the husband had forcibly taken her back home and made his adult daughter call the office, pretending to be her. He was arrested. Once everything was resolved civilly and the woman was in a much more secure shelter, Anna gave me a bottle of wine and a thank you card. She also asked me to stop with the sticky notes, saying, I get it, enough, and apologized again, this time sincerely. The moral of the story, don't treat people like garbage. Even if you have the best intentions and are trying to help, we can all be kind. Now let's move on to the next story. Entitled Karen Tried to Cut My Pay, So I Cut Down Her Business. I'm an Army veteran who was injured in Iraq. I mention this because it's relevant to the story. I worked for a company, well, more like one guy who owned several businesses. He was the richest man in a very small town. First, let me explain how I ended up in this situation. I'll keep it brief to get to the point. I joined the Army before finishing high school, choosing a military specialty I thought I'd enjoy. Since I've always loved tinkering with machines, I became a mechanic. I got a great signing bonus, which helped. During basic training, I only spent money on essentials, so I saved a good amount. I saved even more during advanced training for my military specialty. By the time I finished, I had half my bonus and nearly a full year's salary in the bank. Most people my age would have blown it all, but I invested in the stock market, Bitcoin, and paid off my parents' mortgage. I had a couple more deployments, received the second half of my bonus, and the only thing I splurged on was my favorite car. In short, I had savings, and I invested a portion of them. After leaving the Army, I felt pretty comfortable financially, even despite a messy divorce. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't swimming in cash, but the divorce forced me to sell some assets. Anyone who's followed cryptocurrency over the past 20 years knows how much Bitcoin has skyrocketed. After the divorce, I kept working to rebuild my losses, and honestly, to avoid boredom. As I mentioned, I love tinkering with machines, so I bounced from job to job. A good mechanic can always find work. After decades of that lifestyle, I decided to settle in a small town. I wanted peace and quiet. By then, I was tired of constantly fixing other people's cars and wanted to focus on my own. I bought a small house and saw a hiring ad at a local auto shop. The job seemed straightforward, and I figured it'd cover my minimal expenses easily. I went in to pick up an application, and the locals stared at me like I was a ghost. For context, I'm 6'3", and since leaving the Army, I stopped cutting my hair or shaving. Plus, I have a full sleeve tattoo. It's no surprise some people crossed the street to avoid me. When I returned with the application, an employee named Sue asked me a few questions. She noticed I checked the veteran box, and marked something about equipment on my form. Later that day, Sue called and asked if I could come back to meet the owner. Let's call him Peter. I agreed, and Sue said Peter would be there in an hour, so we could discuss the job. I showed up, and Peter's eyes nearly popped out of his head when he saw me, but we started talking, and my charm won him over. He tossed me a calendar showcasing his car collection, and asked me to name the ones I recognized. There were a couple of Mustangs, a Ford GT, a Bricklin SV1, a Judge, a Demon, a Panthera, and an MXT. He was impressed that I identified the SV1, and we chatted about cars for a bit. He offered me the job, explaining I'd earn $100 a day, working Monday through Saturday, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., with no overtime. I'd get paid for a full day, even if we closed early, take lunch when there was downtime, and have Sundays off. Everything was great, and I worked there for maybe a year without issues. Then Peter asked if I could fill in at his other auto shops in nearby towns, offering an extra $20 a day for travel. The idea was to cover for guys on vacation or sick leave. I agreed, and for about a year, I traveled to his other locations. That's when disaster struck. Peter met Karen, fell head over heels, and married her within a month. He started bankrolling her and her gambling addiction, and that's when things went downhill. One week, I noticed my paycheck was only $250. I asked Sue what was going on, and she said there must have been some changes, and suggested I talk to Peter. No problem. I called Peter, asked to meet, and he showed up with Karen. I asked why I was shorted, and he said bad weather forced us to close early, which affected revenue. I would have let it slide. Peter was a decent guy. But then Karen chimed in, saying it wasn't fair to pay me for a full day if I didn't work all 10 hours. I pointed out that her logic would apply if I were paid hourly, but I had a fixed daily rate, so I wasn't getting compensated for the 19 hours of overtime I put in each week. She declared that things were changing, and I'd now be paid only for the hours I actually work. Fine, Karen, have it your way. The next week was insanely busy. We stayed late to finish customers' cars, and I even gave up a Sunday to cover for a sick coworker. I expected a paycheck around $800, but I got only $600. I had questions. I called Peter and asked, "What's the deal? Why?" He said, "Well, we agreed on $100 a day." I stared at him and asked, "Did you forget about last week?" He responded, "What happened?" I reminded him of our conversation, and he just said, "It is what it is." That's when I lost it. Karen showed up saying, "What's he whining about now?" I looked at her coldly and said, "I worked 80 hours last week, and you paid me $600. She snapped, "You're a contract worker who agreed to $100 a day. Why should we pay you more?" I turned to Peter and asked, "Is this true?" He just said, "You heard the lady." I went home, trying to convince myself I was only working to cover my small expenses. The job was easy, and in this backwater town, my alternatives were building sheds or hauling chickens at a poultry farm. The following week, Karen publicly chewed out one of my coworkers in front of customers for an alleged safety violation, wearing tinted safety glasses. It was nonsense. The garage doors faced east and west, and depending on the time of day, the sun blasted either the upper workers or those below. I shook my head as I passed by, and that caught Karen's attention. She screamed, "Got something to say, you fat bastard." I kept walking. I told Sue she needed to talk to Peter before Karen's antics caused real trouble. Sue just said, "I only handle the bookkeeping. Don't drag me into this." This behavior went on for another year, and finally my patience snapped. The day I started my malicious compliance, I was in a rotten mood. I woke up to news that a good friend, the guy who helped me survive an explosion in Iraq, had been killed by a drunk driver. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I told the auto shop I'd be working in the pit all day, and to leave me alone. The guys, having worked with me for years, knew something was off. I couldn't have imagined I'd have to deal with Karen that day, since I was at the furthest shop, miles away from the casino she usually frequented. But unlucky for me, or maybe lucky, Peter and Karen showed up. She stormed into the pit, yelling, "Peter, come here and look at this mess." I had no idea what she was talking about. I always kept the pit spotless, cleaning as I went, unlike other guys who waited until the end of the day. Her complaint? I'd stacked about 50 commonly used oil filters on empty barrels, so I wouldn't have to wait for someone to hand them down. I'd always done this, and Peter knew it, never objecting. He came down, looked around, and in a tone like he was scolding a teenager, said, "Clean up this pigsty." I shook my head and replied, "Not today, Peter. Get out of here and take her with you." Karen, of course, lost it. She saw this as the ultimate disrespect to her and Peter. Peter said, "If you don't like it, you can leave." So, I walked out. But don't worry, this isn't the end of the story. It was just the first flap of a butterfly's wings that triggered a full-blown disaster. The next day, Peter called and asked me to stop by the main office on my way home. I thought he might apologize, maybe because someone told him why I was so on edge. Nope. He called me in to inform me that, due to my behavior, I was being put on a 6-month probationary period. During that time, I'd be paid $50 a day, and they'd no longer cover the $20 daily travel stipend for working at other shops. I asked if he was serious, and if he'd thought this through. That's when Peter showed his true colors. He said I was lucky they hadn't fired me for my constant disrespect toward him and Karen, and that if he didn't pity me as a poor disabled veteran, he'd have kicked me out long ago. For the record, I never discussed my finances with anyone at work. Peter assumed, based on my appearance, that I was broke and desperate. Something in me snapped, and I started laughing. He asked what was so funny. I stood up to my full height, stepped toward him like a drill sergeant, and said, "You should rethink your life choices, including who you decided to do business with." Peter scoffed. "What are you gonna do, sue me? Go ahead if you think you can afford it. What do you get from the VA? $1,000 a month. I know you need this job." I didn't have a plan yet, but in that moment my malicious compliance mode kicked in. I'm a soldier at heart. If it's war, it's war. That same day I called a labor law attorney, paid a $3,000 retainer, and started a lawsuit for unsafe working conditions, unpaid overtime, and minimum wage violations. I kept working for them, but that wasn't enough. Over those 6 months of probation, my attorney, a former Marine, who I think got my vibe, prepared the case slowly, per my request. When everything was ready, he filed the lawsuit, and Peter and Karen were served papers right in the main office. They read the documents while the process server stayed to record their reactions. I knew they'd be shocked. Peter yelled, "I'd love to beat your face in, you ungrateful piece of trash." Karen screamed, "You're fired. I doubt you even served in the army." The server recorded it all on video and sent it to my attorney, who promptly added a claim for wrongful termination, since firing someone for filing a lawsuit is illegal. The next day, I opened my own auto shop with a car wash and started poaching my former coworkers, offering them higher wages plus a percentage of the jobs. They also wanted in on the lawsuit, and my attorney was thrilled to include them. 2 years after the papers were served, with security footage from all the shops, 5 years of accounting records, and notarized testimonies collected, we finally reached the negotiation phase. They offered a pathetic $50,000 to be split among 15 plaintiffs, which didn't even cover the owed overtime. We refused. Then, unexpectedly, the IRS came to our rescue. In response to our attorney's request for the company's tax records, they sent documents showing that Peter had registered each auto shop as a separate legal entity with its own tax ID and hiring records. Peter and Karen had claimed tax credits for hiring veterans at each of the 6 shops, listing me as a full-time employee working at least 36 hours a week, at $12 an hour. The government offers tax breaks for companies hiring veterans. At the next negotiation, our attorney presented these reports to Peter and Karen's lawyer. After a brief 20-minute discussion, they returned and agreed to our demand: $400,000 for owed overtime to be split among the 15 workers, full coverage of legal fees, plus a personal compensation for wrongful termination of $20,000 per shop, where I was listed as an employee. They also agreed to pay back wages for the 6 months they paid me $5 an hour. Their only condition was that we sign an NDA to keep everything confidential. Of course, we signed the NDA and collected our checks. But somehow the tax records ended up in the hands of the IRS, and soon after an official investigation was launched against Peter and Karen for tax fraud. I sold my auto shop to the guys who joined me in the lawsuit, with each paying me $8,000. I put my house up for sale and left town. About 8 months later, I returned to find that the guy I'd hired to maintain my lawn had been arrested, and the grass hadn't been mowed in months. The city notified me that I'd be fined $100 a day until the property was cleaned up. I went to mow the lawn myself and stopped by the real estate agency to see if I could resolve the maintenance issue. And who do I see behind the counter? Good old Sue, sitting there like nothing ever happened. Sue couldn't wait to fill me in on what had happened, and it was perfect. Peter had filed for bankruptcy to try to save some of his assets after cutting a deal with prosecutors in the tax fraud case and paying a ton of back taxes. Karen had run off with some guy she met at the casino. I asked Sue two questions. Did she know who leaked the tax records to the authorities, and what happened to Peter's car collection? She replied, "No idea, but before you go, check the parking lot behind the real estate office." As I left, I looked around the back, and there it was, a bright green Brooklyn SV1, parked like it was no big deal. It seems Peter had started selling his cars on the cheap, hoping to buy them back after the bankruptcy was finalized. I still don't know who, if anyone, tipped off the IRS. My personal theory is that an IRS employee tasked with gathering those reports noticed something fishy and alerted their supervisor. Either way, justice was served. That's the end of the story. Share your thoughts on all these stories in the comments. I'd love to read them. I'm always curious to hear your similar stories too. Thanks for watching this video to the end. Check out our previous video, which you'll see right here, and good luck. Commentary on the story. Both stories are fantastic examples of real-world drama, workplace conflicts, and the satisfying consequences of standing up for yourself. Here's my take on each. Anand's story. Law firm. The story is compelling because it shows a nuanced situation where Anna, despite her abrasive behavior, isn't a one-dimensional villain. Her arrogance and stress led to unprofessional outbursts, but her eventual accountability and genuine apology redeem her. The narrator's malicious compliance with the sticky notes was a clever, petty way to push back, while still doing the job, and the resolution saving a client from danger and earning Anna's respect felt earned and wholesome. I love how it highlights the power of recognizing voices and trusting your instincts, as well as the importance of workplace respect, even under pressure. The lack of a classic villain makes it relatable, as most workplace conflicts involve flawed but redeemable people. Peter and Karen's story. Auto shop. Oh, this one is a roller coaster of righteous revenge. The narrator's journey from a hard-working veteran to a calculated mastermind of malicious compliance is incredibly satisfying. Peter's betrayal, influenced by Karen's greed, sets the stage for a classic underdog story. The lawsuit, backed by undeniable evidence like the tax records, and the narrator's bold move to open a competing shop show a level of strategic thinking that's inspiring. The twist with the IRS investigation and Karen's downfall feels like poetic justice, especially since their own shady practices, claiming veteran tax credits, fraudulently backfired. Seeing the Brooklyn SV1 in the parking lot was a perfect cherry on top, hinting at Peter's desperation. The story's moral about not underestimating people, especially those with resilience like the narrator, hits hard. Overall thoughts. Both stories share themes of standing up to unfair treatment and the power of persistence, but they differ in tone. The law firm story is more grounded and focuses on personal growth and reconciliation, while the auto shop story is a high-stakes, triumphant takedown of exploitative bosses. I agree with your point about the law firm story's positive resolution being refreshing. It's rare to see a conflict end with mutual understanding. The auto shop story, on the other hand, leans into the satisfaction of watching bad actors face consequences, which is equally cathartic. I'd say both are memorable for their unique spins on malicious compliance and their emphasis on justice, whether through redemption or retribution. What's your favorite part of these stories? And do you have more to share? I'd love to hear your thoughts, or rewrite another one if you've got it.